Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have some other folks will be joining us, but while I give this introduction, just for time, we'll go ahead and proceed. I want to thank everybody for joining. My name is Chris Didle. I'm the co-founder of the OpenAir Collective, which you'll hear about in just a moment. Really excited for this. Very much a citizen-initiated webinar that will focus on the importance of concrete, addressing with emissions from concrete in order to address the larger climate and emissions issues for the state of Pennsylvania. And then we'll really get into legislation and laws that our organization has passed that some folks who have joined OpenAir most recently are interested in seeing if that could be replicated or introduced in some form in Pennsylvania. So what we'll do today, I'll go ahead and move to the program. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to give a presentation. I know that some folks that are joining today are probably new to the whole idea of concrete decarbonization. So I'll cover a bit of ground in that presentation just to sort of set the stage. I'll talk about concrete, its relevance to climate, and then we'll get into why public procurement or what the role of state government is in decarbonization, which is significant. And then we'll have a great conversation with some folks who I'll introduce shortly, including questions and answers from you all in the audience. So feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A panel, and we'll take a look at that. We'll take those as we're talking. During the panel discussion, we're going to have some activist veterans from the concrete decarbonization policy right next door in New Jersey, talking a little bit not only about the bill and the policy we'll be discussing, but their experience of actually advocating for it successfully in New Jersey. And then we'll end with a call to action. Again, the point here is to see if we can build a group of folks, citizens and organizations in Pennsylvania who might be interested in following on the experience of both New Jersey and New York, as well as some other states, and see if we can get a piece of legislation introduced in Pennsylvania and make it law. So let me go ahead and get started. Just a little bit about OpenAir, with some information was included in the Eventbrite, but OpenAir is an all-volunteer citizen action network that's now global in scale, and we focus on advancing carbon dioxide removal technologies and policies, and I'll explain how that links up to concrete. But all volunteer. We have members on every continent where people live in great numbers, and we continue to grow and have an impact. We were founded in New York City in 2019, and now we've got a mailing list of about 5,000 people and about 1,500 people on our Discord platform, which is the virtual platform where our group convenes. Now, of relevance here in terms of the work we do, our members do a lot of different things, from citizen science and making and research, but a huge part of what we do that's really central is policy advocacy. And what we do, which is not entirely unique, but somewhat distinct, is that our citizen members actually come up with the policy ideas, and we even write our own pieces of legislation and then get them introduced. And to date, we've created 10 different pieces of legislation. Most of that is state legislation here in the United States, but we also have a bill live in Luxembourg, in Europe, and quite a few other things cooking in Europe and hopefully in Asia by the end of the year. And we've managed to pass 5 laws and 1 budget amendment in that time. So we've been on quite a roll. In fact, we got 2 of our laws signed into law in Colorado just last week. So things are definitely building in the OpenAir Collective. And one of the things why it's really interesting to talk today to a Pennsylvania audience and all of you is one of the kind of hallmarks of what we do is what we call viral policy. So we might develop a policy in one state or one area, and then through our membership, try to adapt and spread it to other places. And that's really been a feature of our activism from a very early stage, including the bill that we're going to be talking about today, which really got it all started for OpenAir. So what I'll do is I'm going to get into a presentation. Again, I want to cover some ground, understanding that the subject might be quite new to a lot of people. So I'm going to start sort of at a top level about what is the link between concrete and climate, and then we'll get more into the specific policy that OpenAir advocates for, and that hopefully we can see take off in Pennsylvania. So just to get started, we all know what concrete is. We see it every day. It's just an inherent and unavoidable feature of the modern built environment. But folks might not know it's actually the second most used material on Earth after water. We produce anywhere between 35, the numbers are quite fuzzy because it's produced everywhere, Between 35 and 50 billion tons a year of concrete is produced. And importantly, it's not really going anywhere. It's not the kind of thing that we can just sort of magically stop using. It's so foundational to how we build things. And we're really globally going to be using more and more of it rather than less because of the unique performance and characteristics that concrete has. Key thing to underscore up front is that the terms cement and concrete are often used interchangeably. They are related, as I'll explain in a minute, but they are not the same thing. They are different from each other. Concrete is made up of several different ingredients, one of which, a fundamental one, is cement, typically a form called Portland cement. And concrete is really made up, typically there's some other salt and pepper that's in there as well, but the main parts are sand and gravel, which together we call aggregate. That actually makes up most of the mass. Portland cement, and then water. And what Portland cement is, it's the binding agent that takes all of those somewhat unremarkable materials and it binds them together and gives it its cohesion and strength. But it typically only makes, different applications vary, but between 10 and 15% of concrete, but it accounts for about 80 to 90% actually of the carbon dioxide emissions. It's one of the most carbon intensive industrial materials on the planet. And when you add all of it up and all of it we use globally, it's between 7 and 8% of all emissions. And there's stats that you hear that if it was its own country, I think it would be the third or fourth largest emitter in the world. So it's a major source of emissions and a really, really difficult one to solve in a sort of an easy and rapid way. Now, what does it mean what is low carbon concrete? What does it mean to have concrete that is lower than the norm? And a really important thing to underscore is that there's not just this one thing out there that's called low carbon concrete that's its own type of product. Low carbon concrete is really any type of concrete through a variety of different methods. You can reduce the carbon, and that's actually quite a diverse portfolio of things that can be done that's expanding all the time to lower the emissions of concrete. And just to kind of give you a couple of buckets to wrap your head around, there's obviously a lot more detail that we could go into, but the main ways in which the carbon or the emissions of concrete can be reduced is by improving the efficiency or performance of cement plants, where they use a lot of energy and there's a lot of emissions produced there. So there's ways of improving those plants. Of course, using less Portland cement is really the key and most central way of doing that. Is there something we can do to eliminate the amount of Portland cement that we depend on and substitute it with other things? And then other technologies that involve the capture of carbon dioxide, sometimes at cement plants, but also the utilization of carbon in concrete. There's an amazing property of concrete that I'll elaborate on in a minute, is that it can actually it naturally absorbs carbon dioxide, but new technologies are allowing us to inject carbon directly into concrete, where it turns into a rock and would stay forever. So those are the main buckets by which we remove carbon from concrete. But to give you a little bit more sort of specific examples, again, when we talk about increasing the efficiency and also switching out the fuels that are used in cement plants can have some impact, but that ultimately is limited in how much of an impact that can ultimately do. That's not going to take us to where we have to go in terms of decarbonization of cement and therefore concrete. And the real one, as I mentioned, that maybe has the most options right now or is the most available is just the utilization of less cement or less Portland cement specifically. There's types of, not to go into too much detail, but there's types of Portland cement that, grind up limestone that's not been treated with it so that you can use less Portland cement in order to do the same thing. There's this is a mouthful right here, but something called SCMs, which stands for supplementary cementitious materials. So other types of materials that can be used instead of cement or in combination with cement. And some of the most common ones of those that have been around for a really long time are like blast furnace slag, which is a waste byproduct of steel and iron production, or fly ash, which is a waste product from coal. But these, in particular, fly ash, are starting to go away as coal goes away. So while this might be a good use of that waste material, it's diminishing in the marketplace. So we have to find other ways of substituting for cement. One really promising one that we talk a lot about in OpenAir Collective, have dealt a lot with in terms of promoting, is called ground glass pozzolan. This is extremely cool. This is where you take waste glass where can't find recycling markets, you can grind it up into a fine powder, and that can actually be used as a substitute for cement while also addressing a waste stream issue. So that's a very attractive one that is actually now available here in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic states. And then the last one is one that you might hear about, but it's actually much more complicated and nuanced than it's sometimes presented, and that's various forms of capturing carbon and then utilizing it. And because cement is such a carbon intensive process, part of the reason why it's so carbon intensive is because of the chemical process of breaking down limestone releases carbon into the air. And that you can't just substitute by coming up with new fuel sources, renewable or clean or otherwise. That's something that is a unique problem that's almost half of all emissions. And one of the only ways that we know of to really address that will be capturing it at smokestacks, at cement plants. Regardless of what you feel about carbon capture in the electricity sector, it's kind of a unique use case in the cement context. And then this term that I used before, CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, actually includes a lot of different things. It's not just the capture of carbon, but can you then repurpose it or put it into, in this case, concrete, where it would stay forever? It would turn into a mineral form. And there's a number of companies that are doing things like carbon curing. That's literally when you're making your concrete, you're injecting it or you're suffusing it with carbon that could either come from a post-industrial source or even from the air. And then it locks it in there forever. So there's even more companies that I'm listing here that have technologies that do that. You have also people that are working on, can you make materials like aggregate, which make up most of the mass of concrete? Can you substitute those for things that are actually made out of carbon that, again, either comes from smokestacks or that comes directly from the air? Some really interesting companies that are doing that are Blue Planet, Carbonate, and there are others. And then last, cement plant capture, which is what you usually think of when you think of carbon capture. But there are companies, obviously, just to name a couple, that are providing technologies at which this can be captured. Not a lot of this is happening right now. There's only a handful of plants around the world where this is happening. But in the case of cement, it's highly likely that we're going to have to do some point source capture. All right, so that gives you a little bit of a sense of what low carbon concrete is, and we'll get into that more in the discussion. But now to talk about, well, what's the role of government in decarbonizing concrete? And one thing that is really, really important, there's a lot of things that government can do, but one is just as a buyer, and that is what we call procurement. So the government buys all sorts of stuff, as we know, but concrete is somewhat unique because in any given state, the single largest purchaser of concrete will usually be the state itself to make highways and bridges and public buildings, et cetera. And almost 40% of all concrete produced in the US is actually bought by local, state, and federal governments. So they have a substantial role as a buyer. And that can actually, in addition to that, they also regulate the material. So in terms of the specifications or the requirements for the mixes are heavily regulated by the government. So these are two powerful roles that government plays in shaping the present and future of concrete decarbonization. In the recent years, over just really the last handful, maybe 5 years, it's become a much more important area of climate and environmental policy. You've had states like California initially, but it's spread out all over the country and the world, not just at the state level, but also at the local level. You have very interesting things being put in place to try to force or incentivize carbon reduction in concrete specifically. And the federal, I was a co-author of a guide, which maybe Sue, if you could drop that in there, I think I have a link, which is sort of a design guide for state and local low carbon concrete procurement, which kind of talks about best practices, but it shows all the places in the United States, North America, where low carbon concrete procurement policies have been put in place. And the federal government is also, I should have that on the map, as with the Inflation Reduction Act and other efforts, is actually putting major resources into reducing carbon in concrete and cement. So now what I'll end with here is just to talk a little bit about those policies more specifically. What can they actually look like? Because this is what we at OpenAir have had really, really direct and experience with and some success in advancing. And so OpenAir, as I mentioned, started in 2019, and we've been introducing, bills all over the place and other forms of policy advocacy. But it really all got started with a bill called the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, or LECLA. That was our very first bill when we had about 10 people in our community, not several thousand. And it was first introduced in New York State. And now versions of it have been introduced in Massachusetts, Virginia, Illinois. There's a federal version of the bill coming out. But New Jersey has been the place where it's actually been most successful, as I'll explain. It was most recently passed. And again, I kind of map out where you can see versions of this bill have already landed. And again, I mentioned that the federal government has also been putting a lot of money in. But now to talk a little bit about the Leccla bill and how it works, and then we'll get into a conversation about what would it look like in Pennsylvania? Could we actually do something like this in Pennsylvania? But what are the conditions in Pennsylvania that might require it to be a little different? We don't know yet. We're just getting started. But these are the states, again, where we've had a direct role in advancing it. And I want to focus on New Jersey, not only because it's right next door, not only because it just passed, at the earlier part of this year, but of all the different LECLAs that we've passed, it's the best one. It's the one that actually has the most teeth in it, and is probably the one that we would, aspire to some version of in Pennsylvania. And again, what Leccla tries to do is it says, well, the government here buys a lot of concrete. They can act as an early adopter for low carbon forms of low carbon concrete. They can sort of set the standard, start buying it, and that by doing that, they can help create a market that would have a ripple effect beyond the state. You'd have concrete producers start to offer this, and then other people could buy it. And that's really the main roles that we're focusing on with this bill. And the way that it works, and I'm just going to give the simplest sort of explanation of it because I don't want to go too deep into it, but just to give you a sense of how it works, is that it basically creates a threshold that says this is the maximum amount of carbon that you can have in your concrete if you're going to do business with the state. So it sort of draws a line there. And the way that it does that is it uses a type of tool or measurement that's very, very common in the sustainable building practice. Has been around for a long time and continues to evolve, called an environmental product declaration. And you can see a picture of it here. If you think that looks like a nutrition label, it does. It's almost like the equivalent of a nutrition label for products, but it lists, rather than fat and calories and sodium, what are the different environmental impacts that product has. And one of the parts of that that's really, really important that we use in this bill is what's called global warming potential. And this is almost like the carbohydrate sort of level. It's one of the lines within an environmental product declaration that measures the amount of carbon per kg of carbon per cube of concrete. So it's just a numeric value. And so in our bill, what we do is we say, well, this line that we're drawing is going to be based on a number, a global warming potential number. This is sort of the optimal policy. But then if anybody who's producing and selling concrete to the state goes below that number, they'll get an incentive. They'll actually get some resources for beating that threshold. And in the case of New Jersey, for concrete producers that fall below that threshold that's set, they get a tax credit that's up to 5% of the value of the sale that they made. And for an industry like concrete, where it's like razor thin margins, it's a dirt cheap commodity. If you're talking about a 5% bump that you're giving somebody for beating that threshold and being low carbon, that's significant. That's quite a strong incentive. And that what we also have is for special technologies that take carbon that otherwise would have gone into the air and they put it in concrete through any of those methods that I explained before, they can get an additional 3% of an addition. And this is a way of really kind of looking at a very promising technology category and trying to really add an additional incentive there to increase adoption. So up to an 8% additional tax credit that you can get is really, really quite significant in this industry, and will be going into effect in the next, Sue and Sean and others on the call can tell us, but within the next year, this policy will be implemented in New Jersey. So now I will go ahead and stop, and we'll talk a little bit with our panel about the experience in New Jersey. I can speak to New York, where I was very involved in that campaign, but start to think about what might this look like in Pennsylvania if we were to do it. And as we have this discussion, please do put any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we'll just fold them right in. And we hope that some of the folks that are in the audience, it's a small group that we have. This is recorded, so we'll send it out to the full RSVP list. We hope that some of you are interested in getting involved in activism in support of a Leccla Pennsylvania bill. Okay, so our panel discussion today, just for time, I'm just going to do very short intros here, and then I'll, with my free hand, throw in the full bios of the panel. But we have two veterans of the New Jersey Leccla campaign. In fact, the two people who led it, who formed a group together and over the course of almost 2 years, went through all sorts of twists and turns and managed to get this bill introduced and turned into law and signed by the governor. And that's Sue Dorward and Sean Mohan. Sean's located not too far from Philadelphia, right over the border. And then we're really pleased to have Matt Walker, who's the advocacy director for the Clean Air Council based in Philadelphia. And hopefully what Matt can do is give us a little bit of perspective on what is carbon deindustrial policy, environmental policy, climate policy like in Pennsylvania right now that might create some openings or even maybe some closed doors for a policy like this. So we're looking forward to Matt's perspective and feedback on what we discussed. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn off the presentation. And if my panelists want to go ahead and join me by turning on their cameras and their microphones, that would be great. Rick, take it away.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody who joined us for this evening's panel discussion. So I represent the Philadelphia chapter of the Foundation for Climate Restoration, and we are co-hosting this with Chris from the OpenAir Collective. So really, just to back up just a little bit, I don't want to take much time, maybe just a moment to just let you know that with carbon dioxide removal, which is important because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has determined that in order for us to remain below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and therefore to keep from or to prevent the worst effects of climate change, that we need to not only reduce our emissions, but we also need to draw them down from the atmosphere. And so that's why we are here this evening, because this is one method, is through the capture of carbon in the cement, in the concrete making process. So I just want to add one more thing, is that for anybody who's interested in joining our coalition to try to push this kind of legislation in Pennsylvania, if you would just drop your name and your email in the chat. And if you don't feel comfortable with doing that, then just reach out to us, and I will put my my email, Richard Cole, into the chat as well. So thanks for joining us, and I'll let Chris take it away with continuing on with the panel discussion.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Really appreciate it. What I actually did, Richard, just to make it even a little bit easier for us to collect, if folks want to, this little form here, which just says name, email, and where you are. That's kind of if you're interested, you're not signing your life away here. We got a small group here. This is how, as Sean and Sue will tell you, Sue will be back on a second. Her internet dropped off. Things start quite humbly in the beginning, and
that's right.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll get right into that in a second, Sean, because I'd like you to really underscore that. And not only did they start small, they actually remained small in terms of the level of activists who were really committed to this, who became real citizen lobbyists and really drove this thing. And we depended on larger groups of people to make phone calls and things like that. But it was really a core of really committed activists, volunteer activists, who made this whole thing happen in New Jersey. So why don't we go ahead and start with that, if we can. And Rick, definitely stay on too. I'd love to have you kind of chime in with questions as we go, because it's really, we want to learn here about what this looks like. But Sue will be on in a second. But Sean, I'm wondering if you could give a little bit of background on what the New Jersey experiences was, and I'll tee you up a little bit, because this is how it rolled into my life. Is that I was working on the New York version of the bill, which did get signed into law by Governor Hochul at the beginning of this year. And I wrote the bill with a couple of other people on a Google Doc, and slogged away through COVID and ultimately got it passed. But while that was happening, Sue Dorward, who just rejoined us, Sue, I'll go ahead and make you co-host, so you should be able to turn your video on. She reached out and she said, this is a really interesting bill. I think we could probably, I could give it a try. I could try to get it introduced in New Jersey. And I think that was December of 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. It was a long time ago, Sue. And then that's how it all started. So I wonder if between Sue and Sean, if you can give people a picture of a little bit of what then happened after that, an encapsulated history of the campaign.
Sure. So, this campaign had all the bells and whistles, and it was my first attempt at anything of the sort. And Chris was super supportive, getting me and the team set up to work on it. But it all started off, I've been studying for my master's of carbon management at Columbia, and I learned about low carbon concrete as part of one of my classes there. And I heard about the bill, contacted Chris, and the whole driving event for it was that I work as the sustainability coordinator for our local community college, and as a member of the college, I'm on this local Chamber of Commerce committee called Sustainable Somerset for our county, as Somerset County. And there's a whole bunch of environmentally focused companies and people on that group. And as part of their events, they meet with legislators. And so we had this legislative meeting coming up with Assemblyman Zwicker, who and at the end of the meeting, I mentioned this bill. I said, hey, it's been introduced in New York already. Would you be interested in doing something like that in New Jersey? And he was, I believe, the chair of the Assembly, Innovation and Technology Committee. So he just happened to be the right one of the people who would be interested in doing something new, technically. And he said, sure, send me an email and we'll take a look at it. Maybe we can do it. And at that point, I thought, it's already been introduced in New York. Chris did all the hard work. OpenAir already wrote the bill. We just have to, push it through. And little did we know it wasn't that easy. But that's how it got its start. And, and we just had a few people in OpenAir who were from New Jersey. And I started putting feelers out on Facebook, and started talking to the Sustainable Somerset organizations to see if they'd be interested in being official supporters of the bill, and my college to see if they would support the bill. And I found Sean, I think, approached me after I posted on Facebook, and he brought a lot of talent to our group as well. But it grew. We had somebody from 350.org who found one of their members who was interested, and they brought in a friend, and then Sean brought in some people, and it slowly grew to, we had maybe a core group of 7 citizen activists working on it. And then we started pulling in environmental organizations, some of whom had been involved in New York, and we approached their New Jersey counterparts, and some organizations like Sean can talk about that he's involved with, but it just grew kind of organically, and we started getting sponsors. I mean, it was a real collaborative effort. I have to say that it wasn't like one person could do it all. Everybody had different connections and different strengths and different amounts of time that they could contribute. And we just kind of said, okay, here's the list of legislators, who's in your district, who do we think would be interested in the bill based on their voting record. Here's a list of organizations we kind of compiled with Chris's help that might be interested in supporting it. And then, okay, group members, what do you want to do this week? Who do you want to reach out to? And we kind of went from there, do you have an interest in connecting with this group, or do you already have a relationship with this group? And then we get into the later phases. But Sean, do you want to jump in and talk about how we got going?
Sure, I'm just laughing, Sue. Thanks very much. I apologize for not sharing my video. I have low latency, I'm laughing, Chris and Sue. We had what, 5 people on that core team for the first 6 months, and there's 14 people on this call. So the gauntlets to UPA, you guys should be able to do it twice as fast as we did it. In all seriousness, what helped a lot was that there was already a good piece of legislation from New York that we could copy, and it's square peg round hole in some places. So there will be some very specific Pennsylvania tweaks that have to be made, but a lot of the heavy lifting has already been done in terms of, at least there's a draft to red ink, and that's a big part of it. Also, in the age of Zoom, it's not that hard to get your assembly folks and your state senators on a call to talk to them about this stuff. So this is not as hard as it used to be. The one thing I will say is that, when we think about Pennsylvania, we think about all the new SEPTA stations we're going to need, and 476 and the Schuylkill and that new Sixers arena, and Temple and Villanova and LaSalle all needing new dorms. The state of Pennsylvania procures a massive amount of concrete, and legislation like this can help us lower by half the amount of emissions that come from that. And that's why it's so important to us as environmentalists. That's a real difference in it. There were some false starts with us, but it was not that hard. We did not have to move mountains to make this happen. It took some time, right? And we had some days and some emails where we were like, oh man, this stinks. But we got back on the horse and we got it done ultimately. And 2 years is not a long time. And I think Pennsylvania could get it done faster. The only other thing I'd say about Pennsylvania is that I wouldn't be discouraged in terms of the makeup of the legislature, because this is not, and I say this as a tree hugger, this is not your mom and pop tree huggers environmental bill. This is the kind of thing where you may find some strange bedfellows in terms of it's a carrot instead of a stick. So it's almost what I would call business-friendly climate legislation. There are tax incentives as opposed to fines. So that's some of the stuff where you may be able to peel off some folks that you wouldn't necessarily think would be supporting environmental legislation. I'm sorry, that was long-winded.
No, I think that last part you raised is really, really key. Is that people? I'm a solar guy by background. I worked in solar for 15 years, all over the place, and was new to concrete, kind of fell into it backwards. And the first thing you hear is that, concrete makers are so conservative and they never want to change. And the reality is that no one asked them to. It's a material we've been making basically the same way for, since Portland cement 200 years ago, and the Romans had their own version of it thousands of years ago. So it's been around a long time. But if you give an incentive that really causes the private sector to say, all right, I want to reduce my carbon emissions. You're putting, cash in my pocket. That kind of trumps politics to a certain degree. And I wonder if Sue, I think one of the things that's astounding about this bill is the guy's working on climate and environmental legislation for 20 years, my whole career. The level of bipartisanship that ultimately happened, I think, is the real story about it. And I don't know if you want to just summarize for what those numbers were. In New Jersey.
Yeah, well, so we didn't have, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, all of our sponsors and co-sponsors were Democrats. But as soon as we started getting businesses on board, they realized industry was on board. We had some chambers of commerce in support. The contractors, ultimately, when it became a tax incentive, the contractors didn't oppose it, which was a big deal, which was basically support. Once we had the contractors on board, the Republicans were there. They wanted something that didn't have mandates. There was no requirement that people use low carbon concrete. There was just this carrot of, if you do, and it's all been tested and it's going to be safe, and you do use it, there's this benefit. Both financially and to the environment, you have a good message. I think part of the concrete industry is getting beaten up about climate, and this allows them to give a good message that, there are ways to be greener and they're in support of that. So I think everybody was ultimately looking to do the right thing or a good thing. But there were, we had to make sure we addressed concerns along the way, like the contractors were critical. We weren't going to get Republican support without the contractors, and even our sponsors didn't want to move forward without making the contractors happy. And then we had to go, there's actually a good amount of work for our Department of Environmental Protection to kind of set up the criteria and the processes and the certification, and, what's that threshold and what's the formula for the incentive and so on. So we had to make sure that was laid out in the bill and had the blessing of the governor. Like, we were all ready to go. And then we, for our final vote in the Senate, and, the governor's office was like, I don't know, we've got some questions, and we had to hold off and reintroduce the following session. But ultimately, it made the bill better. And our sponsor kind of had this, she had two high bars. One, she wanted everybody at the table, and she wanted to address everyone's concerns. So she really helped us get this bipartisanship. But two, she wasn't going to try to pass it and then get the governor aspect of it worked out afterwards. She wanted to know up front this was going to go through and everybody was happy with it. So she held off until it was right. And we had to put in a couple of rewrites. The royal we. I'm not the policy writer, but some of the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters and actually a lobbyist for a low carbon concrete company got involved, and they had great relationships already with all the major players and helped move it through. And we were, Shauna and I were kind of, the grassroots supporters involved in watching the whole process, seeing how the sausage is made. But we brought in, we had enough support from these other organizations that they were willing to go to bat and help us see it through. So I feel lucky to be able to sort of, I wasn't in all the meetings with the governor and the senators and the contractors, but I heard about it all, and I was grateful for our partners to be able to smooth the way in those areas.
Yeah, the League of Conservation Voters was so clutch, and Allison unfortunately couldn't make it tonight because of a last minute thing that came up. But the coalition was amazing. One thing I really want to bring Matt in to kind of get a little bit of his perspective, and even to ask us some questions about how it happened, but also to kind of try to place this idea maybe in Pennsylvania. But before we do that, one thing I do want to underscore too is that, as I mentioned in my presentation, concrete is different than other emission sources where, I spent my whole career, it's about shutting down fossil fuel plants and ending extraction. And that remains, I think everybody at OpenAir is on board with that. But concrete is a really, really difficult industry to get rid of in a climate meaningful time frame. So you're going to be dealing with this industry, which is predominantly, it's dominated by small businesses that are very local. It's not, it's mostly kind of mom and pop type of industry that's spread out all over the state and all over the country. So you also have to be, not risk to put too much of a penalty on these local businesses that are in every part of the state. So I guess a big lesson from that is you have to look at everything, every emission source that you're trying to solve on its own terms and construct policies from that rather than, sort of shoehorning something from the electricity sector or transportation. But Matt, I don't know if this is, we kind of jumped right into it on the policy detail, but curious to get any initial thoughts or even questions that you have before we talk about what of maybe industrial decarbonization strategy or policy in Pennsylvania.
Sure. And if I could just give a quick intro to Clean Air Council. We're a Pennsylvania-based nonprofit organization. We've been around since 1967. Before the Clean Air Act, before the EPA, we were around protecting everyone's right to a healthy environment. We have engineers, organizers, and attorneys that all work together, and advocates, of course, to look at proposed infrastructure, existing infrastructure that might be polluting people's communities, and and help, in particular, work with residents in communities, and especially environmental justice communities, to raise their concerns. Might be about a proposed facility, and at the state level, local level, and actually at the national level too, promote policies that put stronger protections in place around industrial sources of emissions, mostly fossil fuel industries. We also work on sustainable transportation. So I just wanted to give a quick background on that. I think in terms of the sort of the climate kind of like energy landscape in PA, it's tough. I think things are different now than they have been for a really long time. With Democrats actually having control of the House by one seat in the last 10 or 12 years. It's been that long since they have. I've been with the council for almost 12 years. So in that time, this is really the first I'm seeing Democratic control. The status quo up to now is that nothing on climate has really been able to go through. And now, with some exceptions, it depends how things are framed. There was this whole home repair bill that was passed by both House and Senate and became law, which deals with home repairs and weatherization. So bipartisan law on that, but really focus on sort of homes and repairing homes. And I think there was a lot of sort of common interests from a lot of different parts of that coalition that folks brought together. But on other issues, like there's been a community solar bill, for instance, for years now that still hasn't been passed, even though there's labor support. The electrical workers, farmers union supports it, still hasn't gotten passed in Pennsylvania. A lot of just anything environmental at the state level, it's pretty much been an uphill battle and not likely to pass. It's mostly been legislation to kind of start the conversation and hope for a future where there's some different politics and where you could advance something. But I'll say there's still a lot of unknowns. I think both the Democratic House and also the Shapiro administration, their environmental priorities are not yet fully fleshed out. I think Shapiro says he wants to be, wants to take serious action on climate, but at the same time has expressed skepticism about Pennsylvania joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That's tied up in the courts right now. We don't know exactly what he wants to do with it, but he's sort of pulling together this stakeholder group to discuss it and kind of figure out where there might be commonality. But it's interesting to think about this, like the tax credit idea. And my big question, sort of going into this, is around like how will the building trades, in particular in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia, have a lot of power, have given campaign financing to a lot of elected officials and have some sway. And so kind of just thinking about what their members, which would include cement masons, would say to this. Okay, it's a tax incentive. If industry wants to get more money, they can do this. Is that going to cost them more money to get? Is that going to push them out of the market? If another company, maybe a non-union labor company, comes in and does this and gets the priority over them, is there going to be any concerns raised? That's a big question for me in Pennsylvania. But Pennsylvania does have a history of giving industry tax credits, especially most recently the petrochemical industry and the Shell cracker plant. And that's a huge tax breaks for years and years, and additional tax credits for other petrochemical facilities beyond that one Shell petrochemical facility in southwestern Pennsylvania. So that's, I think, a lot of my questions kind of revolve around that. And then I have some other thoughts about, if you want to come back to it, some sort of potential issues or snags you might run into, but also some potential opportunities you might think about.
I have a couple of thoughts on what you just said, Matt. So one thing that I've seen in the news recently is that Pennsylvania, at least some of the Republican folks, have been supportive of carbon capture and storage efforts, which has a lot of federal funding coming out through the IRA bill that was passed last year. And that's something that we didn't get into in New Jersey at all. But the piece of the bill that's associated with storing the CO2, our bill says that CO2 has to come from the environment or be captured from the air. It can't be from flue gas, or it could, I think it also could be captured from the cement plant. But it couldn't be from flue gas. But that turns out to be not super practical in today's CO2 market. A lot of the CO2 is, it's either mixed together or it's from flue gas or from ethanol plants or something that wouldn't qualify under our bill. But if that was tweaked for Pennsylvania to allow for CO2 from flue gas, that might get some of your Republican folks on board, the ones who are considering, the carbon capture and storage route of sort of pursuing fossil fuels by being able to capture the CO2. Now that might anger the environmental folks. So kind of having, have your cake and eat it too issue, but it's an approach to think about.
Yeah, the carbon capture sequestration, we at the Clean Air Council, but other partners too, are see this as a way for some of the it is Republicans, elected officials saying this mostly, but not exclusively, that it is a way to sort of continue fossil fuels, especially the gas industry in Pennsylvania. It's a way to continue doing that. We can do that. We can capture carbon. So in that, if you frame it that way, and this is just another way you can capture carbon from all these emissions, maybe that would actually be supported in a kind of funny way. And there could be, I think there's concern about from the environmental community, at least in Pennsylvania, is storing carbon dioxide kind of in underground reservoirs and pipelines that haven't been proven to be safe over long periods of time, and kind of questions about safety or health risks of that. So I think if it's been like, from what I've listened to podcasts from David Roberts on cement, that's pretty much my knowledge base for this topic. But if it's actually locked in sort of forever in concrete, then that might be something more palatable for the environmental community as well.
I had a couple more points. One is, I forgot to mention, we had an academic partner, a professor at NJIT, who got involved and helped explain basically what Chris just explained at the beginning of the webinar. But having an academic partner can help too. Like, if people are concerned about what is this thing that we're talking about, that at least you go out to academia, and hopefully they're not considered to be, politically motivated. And then the other thing you mentioned was the concrete industry players and how powerful they are. One of the folks that, and Sean may have contacted them, is it Silva or Sylvie?
Yes, Sylvie.
Construction,
Sylvie, yeah.
in the Philly area. They are one of the customers of Carbon Cure, which is a low carbon concrete company where they inject CO2 as the concrete's being mixed.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming, based on that they would be in support of this bill, and they might be a great advocate.
Great.
Yeah, and one thing I just had, I think Chris hit on this earlier, the building trades were the first group we reached out to. And there's a lot of nuance that goes along with that conversation, and it's a long part of the conversation. That won't be settled in one meeting. That's probably going to be one of the longer parts of this. But what the best part about it is that, we got them to the point where, they weren't, it was never we love this bill, but it was like, we're not against it. And sometimes that's as big a win as we support it, right? And so there's going to be a few of those along the way with this.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I think figuring out the specifics, if you get the billing trains on board, I think this becomes a lot easier to do in Pennsylvania with the politics. You know, in terms of the carbon capture sequestration, I think you do need to figure out the sort of the specifics around that too, because I think groups, including like Clean Air Council, will be looking at this and figuring out like, is this going to be something that just allows the fossil fuel industry to continue doing its thing, and we're just capturing the carbon from that and we're injecting it in the concrete? That's cool, but like, we don't want to be continuing to prop up the industry and let them continue to create emissions. So I think
100%. But I'm sorry, Matt, to just say like that's the right question to ask. The good news is even some of our the more respected atmospheric scientists who have questioned some of the extent of carbon removal say, okay, but for cement, that's one that makes sense. So, we talk about Catherine Hayhoe and Michael Mann. They actually say, okay, the case of cement and concrete, that's where this actually we can get on board with you.
Right. Yeah, you're not putting into underground reservoirs and pipelines and setting all this infrastructure up where it hasn't been proven. You can lock it into concrete forever. Yep.
And also getting the trades on board, at least the concrete industry folks. I mean, in the 70s, mixing slag and fly ash in to substitute for cement was done all the time because it was cheaper. Now it's not cheaper anymore, or at least it wasn't. I in a couple of concrete projects on the campus where I work, we had to pay, I think, 5% more to get steel slag as our substitute. So this is where our bill makes a difference, where they can feel comfortable and kind of do old school stuff, or they can try the glass pozzolan. I just talked to a block maker in Brooklyn that is making block with carbon cure and positive glass. So, even if they're worried about the whole carbon cure injecting CO2 piece, they can still have a huge impact by reducing the amount of cement they're using by replacing it with other materials. And hopefully they're comfortable with having done that in the past and going back to that and having an incentive to go back to that.
Yeah. This is really interesting too, because it's not, we deal a lot with very controversial issues in Pennsylvania and trying to do legislation on things like oil and gas, setback requirements away from fracking, like from people's homes and schools and things like that. It's very controversial. This comes across to me as not a very controversial bill, which make it that much easier to at least think about trying in Pennsylvania. I know I've worked in Pennsylvania for a long time, so I'm probably sounding a little bit. I'm actually an optimist, but I'm probably sounding a little bit pessimistic about Pennsylvania in general, because I just think the legislature just has a bad track record when it comes to climate action and environmental protection. We're usually rolling back environmental protections and trying to save them and preserve them. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. But with this issue, I haven't heard, none of my colleagues have really heard anyone in Harrisburg talking about the issue at all. Like, it hasn't come up. It's not on our radar. I actually read about it in The Big Fix recently, which I happened to be reading. It talked about it in there. And that was when I first heard about this idea of bringing up the procurement policies. So it's not on anyone's radar. So I think this would, you would need to think about sort of a major educational campaign to both elected officials and the public, because this is a little bit of a wonky, frankly, boring topic for a lot of people. And so I think you're going to need to figure out how to get people excited about it. I'm glad everyone who joined tonight. It's great. But I think, to get this to be more popular, we're gonna have to think about, and maybe you guys did this in New Jersey, but like the communications and the messaging and all that. How do we talk about this?
It's almost an advantage to it, but it's funny too. Like, as a guy who worked in solar and also works in when you get close to the subject, it's actually a fascinating material and a fascinating industry and the issues about it. But again, you're not gonna pack climate marches with people talking about grab glass pozzolan. But
exactly.
But I think that was kind of in a way that it was this new thing that people weren't focusing on. We were able to sort of shape perceptions of it right out of the gate. There was a big learning curve we had to do. But, one of the things maybe this is a good place to sort of end before we just sort of reemphasize, Matt, we'd love to tap you for your wisdom a little bit, give us a sense of the landscape when we think about coalition building. And we've had some good messages here in the chat of people that are clearly interested. But I think one of the things that was so remarkable, and I'll put myself in there too, I knew nothing about this subject at all, right? Sue and Sean knew nothing about it, and it is a complicated subject. And it's amazing how when you do activism like this, how you develop an expertise. And Sue, you had Bloomberg calling you up, and people within the governor's office that, and so for those of you who might be like, well, I'm new to activism, I'm certainly new to concrete. That's one of the real joys of this is you learn, it's a thing that you learn when you're fighting for it. And so what I would say is I did post a little sign up form there again, if you're just interested in learning a little bit more or joining a call with a small group as we sort of lay out what could be done here. And this also includes, Matt, we didn't talk about it, but there are municipal plays here as well. You got places like Portland, Austin, where I live, small governments in New York State, San Francisco now, Vancouver, that have implemented their own procurement policies at the municipal level. And that helps when you look at state stuff. Then you get a stake in the ground, you can show a model policy, and then maybe you fight for, stuff at the larger level. So we want to talk about these things in our next follow-up call. And if this sounds like something that's of interest to you to at least explore, please do fill out that form. I'm going to send out the video recording of this along with that form in the next day or so to everybody who RSVP'd, so you'll have another opportunity. But come on in and learn a little bit, and you never know, you might get absolutely addicted to it, like Sean and Sue and myself, and get a law passed in the process. So, but with that, I want to thank the whole panel, and I didn't know, Rick or Vic, if you guys had any final statement about kind of a takeaway that you might have had, or anything you might want to end the evening with.
Chris, can I just interject for 1 second to agree with what you said about the municipal action? I think that's maybe the best place to start in Pennsylvania, is to look where you guys have your members, and if you're they're in maybe some more progressive counties and municipalities, look there. I think again, if the building trades are on board, Philadelphia is an option. Same thing for Allegheny County. But yeah, some of the municipalities in like the collar counties around Philly or Pittsburgh, if you have a good, strong membership base there, I'd look to where you have folks on the ground and kind of build out samples. Because I agree. Same thing with what we call the Protected Buffers campaign, the state level, pushing for better setbacks from oil and gas. We're doing that at the local level first too, and you can kind of point to models, point to successes, and show that people want this across Pennsylvania. So yeah, I think that's the way to go.
Absolutely. Noted. Yeah. So that'll be a subject of discussion for our first call, is state or municipal. But yeah, Richard and Vic, I didn't know if you had anything just to help us wrap up here.
No, other than the fact that if people are interested in joining a coalition, that they should reach out to us. It certainly sounds like there's more. It's going to be more of a push here in Pennsylvania than New York and certainly New Jersey. And we understand that's going to be very involved. Maybe trips to Harrisburg. I don't know how that went in Jersey, whether there was a physical presence in, was it Trenton that is the...
Yeah, we went to Trenton a couple times to testify. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And if you folks are available here and there as we plot along through this process and build our coalition, and we have to roll up our sleeves and get become subject matter experts.
Yeah, I want to also thank you all very much for your input, and I also like Matt's idea of pushing on the municipal level where we have even more contacts. I think maybe we can do that simultaneously and in a parallel way. But this has been so helpful, and we're very grateful.
Great. Well, thanks. We'll be getting together soon. Maybe Vic and Richard and myself will come up with a date for the first sort of meetup for it that I can include in my mail with the video. But please don't be a stranger. Please do be in touch, and hopefully we can really get some stuff going in the Keystone State, or at least Philadelphia.
Actually, I think June the 12th is a possible date that we've talked about.
Okay.
To begin to work. Okay.
Why don't we confirm that, and we'll let our RSVPs know. But thank you, folks. Enjoy your evening and enjoy the fine weather. See you.
Great. Thanks. Take care now.
Thank you.